see you.
Good
You
to
got
see
your
you
tech
too.
support, Roxy?
Yes, I'm here with tech support. If I was not near Marlo, I would be like, I've only been here like 10 minutes, and within the first minute, she had to help me. Like my computer already broke because no, she's just sweet. So I need to hang out with you more. Oh, is that it? Oh, I did not know. Well, I need to be, I need to hang out with you more because you're really on your computer all the time, and I need to do better. My iPad just travels with me. It's like an arm to me.
That's what it's there for.
So is everybody still home?
Still home?
Good.
We had a trip to urgent care yesterday, but, you know, that was fun.
Oh, really? Oh, no, I saw you with the arm.
Yeah,
So,
that was fun.
The buckle fracture. I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, well.
Well,
it happens.
You need to quit pushing her in the pool. You need to quit picking on her.
Yeah, that's what I need to do.
I see Jonathan.
Hello, everybody. Good to see everybody. Hope
Hi.
everybody's well. Yeah.
Why can't I mute mine? Oh, wait. Is it different?
Mr. Sutton, are you unmuted or muted? You're muted.
Michael's muted. It's 2 o'clock, so we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to work session. Hope everyone is enjoying themselves, having a good afternoon, healthy and safe. Thank everyone for being on today. Jump right in and get started. Got a pretty packed agenda this afternoon. Again, welcome everyone. Taking a look at our agenda today, we've got we'll start out with our proposed 2021 budget work session. We'll move to school enrollment plan after that, and then do our typical COVID update that will take us right up to 5:30, hopefully if not before. We want to make sure that we are off in time so that we start at 5:30 this time. The last time we went over a little bit and trying to get on, they didn't see us. So they thought they would have some technical difficulties on us late. So try to be a little bit more prompt today. So we'll get started with our budget work session. First up is David Leader with Mark Winters, the staff. Or after you want to 7 minutes about the budget first, or straight to David.
Kathy, this is David. Keith was fading out. He wanted to know if you want to do anything to introduce the budget or if you wanted me to just launch into it.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm happy to introduce where we are. I couldn't keep, Mr. Sutton, you were fading in and out, so I was having trouble hearing you. I'll just start by saying that as was in the superintendent's budget letter at the beginning of the proposed budget from my office, it reflects a lot of work and a lot of thought where we made some adjustments, quite frankly, at the 9th hour, looking at what was happening with the pandemic and the financial impact on our community locally, statewide, and actually nationally. So we want to continue to make sure that we work thoughtfully through all of this. It does represent a bare minimum of needs that we have. And I look forward to the discussion and the questions that you guys have already proposed as we move forward towards a target of adoption at May 5th at the board meeting so that we can deliver a budget on time to the county commissioners by May 15th. And then once the board's proposed budget is with the county commissioners, we will work to find some time and ways to engage with them prior to a final disposition and adoption of the county's budget. And now I'll turn it over to David.
Okay, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to switch and bring up a PowerPoint. Okay. And what we'd like to do to start off your work session today is give you a very brief recap of the superintendent's proposed budget, and then move into reviewing highlights of new additional federal and state actions that have taken place in response to COVID-19, things we didn't know even 2 weeks ago, or things we gained additional clarity on. We want to then review current year unplanned savings, costs, and related implications related to COVID-19. And then we want to answer any additional questions about the board questions and staff responses that we received since it was presented to you 2 weeks ago. We did present those responses, loaded them into Assembly on Friday, received a few more questions late Friday. Those responses were loaded into Assembly on yesterday. We have embedded those questions and responses in the slides just so you have them, but that being said, it is not our plan to go through each of those slides, but rather just have the board ask any questions they may have, additional questions or clarification about the responses before turning it back over to the board for their discussion and then any potential direction for revisions. So with that, I'll start the brief recap. It is a $1.8 billion operating budget, and to stress, it is based upon current state formulas. It's what we had at the time. We don't know if the formulas will change, but there is a likelihood that that will be the case if the state sees revenue reductions and has to in turn make revenue reductions to all those entities that it funds. You may recall back in the 2008-2009 Great Recession, one of the ways they passed those along to their different agencies was in the form of a discretionary reduction, and they gave a dollar amount of what the organization had to cut, and they let the entity or organization determine where that needed to come from. It does, as Ms. Moore said, request an increase in local funding of just under $30 million and invest just under $9 million in fund balance. And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit. Of that $29 million, $18 million has to do with legislative impact items. I'm not going to go through each of these items. We covered them 2 weeks ago. I do want to remind everyone, though, about the potential risk for charters. The estimates or projections that the county, Wake County staff, and third parties put together had a very low increase in student population for Wake County Public Schools, a bigger increase in student population for the charters. We think all bets are off on this given the current pandemic, and we're just going to have to wait and see. The other increases here beyond charters, the biggest ones are for state employee benefit increases that we have to locally pay. Operating costs, $2.8 million, basically cover the cost of operating a new elementary school, South Lakes. Growth, you'll see just $400,000 being requested, and that's based upon the net student growth. That does maintain our existing resource allocation formulas. Special education services, $700,000 requested for teachers and instructional assistants and speech language pathologists. Program continuity, the majority of that was so we continue for the full year 1% certified supplement increase that was implemented in the current year. We only had funding, recurring funding, when we implemented that for 0.5%, but we went ahead and went out on a limb, if you will, and put in place a full 1%. So that will require funding. $2.2 million for increased lease escalation costs and associated insurance. And then deferred operational needs. This is the area that we began a year ago, an area of needs that had basically made a secondary priority since the Great Recession, and even after recovery out of the Great Recession was not made a priority. That was the genesis for putting together a five-year funding plan for key areas, including our maintenance and operations, our non-certified compensation, instructional support technicians. We have social emotional learning in there as well. Those are not all on this slide. Those had about a 10% funding in the first year, with the balance to be made over the prior 4 years. Well, in this refined budget that Ms. Moore spoke to, that we really took significant cuts out at the last minute, it's now down even more. And again, I'm not going to go through the numbers. Last on this page, you'll see newer expanding programs, a $1.7 million request. The $1 million request for the social emotional learning is assuming that funding for these staff will be coming from the state. It was included in their 2-year budget in the second year, but again, the state may be put into a position if they do not have the revenue streams to make a change to that. So I'm going to now switch out of the recap of the superintendent's proposed budget and begin the section on highlights of federal and state actions in response. This first action we did share with you 2 weeks ago. The state did distribute $50 million to all the LEAs that was available out of current funding. We received $3.8 million of that to use in the current year. We made the decision to direct those funds to pay child nutrition staff, given their area is receipts driven. And even though many, not all, but many of these staff are continuing to work in our food distribution operations now, we're not getting direct receipts to pay for their labor. We will, I should say, be reimbursed for the food costs, but not for all of the labor. So these funds are estimated to take us through from mid-March through the end of April. The next area we get into, these are highlights from the CARES Act. This is a federal act that will pass money to the states, and then the states in turn can pass it to their agencies. But it is federal money that just flows through the state. There are two components to it. The first component is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. Nationally, there's just over $13 billion available. North Carolina will receive just under $400 million. And based upon the state's allotment formula, they're using a formula similar to how they allot Title I funds, we will receive somewhere between $24 and $26 million of funding. We did learn in a webinar this morning that that is subject to change, not materially though. It is in the form of a grant, which will include us completing an application. They fine-tuned the timing on that. It would appear at this point they're targeting having those applications be submitted by the third week in May and targeting award and distribution of those funds at some point in June. The second component of the CARES Act is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. At the national level, it's $3 billion. The amount targeted for North Carolina is $95 million. At this point, there's been no conversation as to what portion would go to K-12 education, because this funding is available for other purposes as well, including higher education. So stay tuned on this one. Some additional things we have learned since we gave you an update 2 weeks ago. The federal government now has provided the opportunity for some carryover flexibility. On the 16th, BPI applied to the U.S. Department of Education for a waiver request, and then very quick turnaround on April 21st, USAID did approve that request, and basically it extends the period of availability for specific federal funds. It basically extends for 12 months the availability for a set of fiscal year 18-19 federal awards. Those are multi-year awards, and while they would have expired on September 30th of this year, receiving this waiver will allow us to continue to use those funds through September of 2021. This is important because carryover amounts, as we get into times where we're having to determine how we cover funding and having to shift funding, carryover funding and having that flexibility is a very important tool. And this is a good example of why putting spending restrictions in place for even federal funds is important in a thoughtful manner during times like these. I'm not going to read this chart. I'll just let everyone take a look at it. The top portion are the programs that have been given this carryover flexibility. And again, it's just for fiscal year 18-19 funding. And then the bottom two lines are the programs that at this point, DPI has not received guidance on carryover flexibility. Excuse me for going backwards. The State Board of Education and DPI did present last week funding needs to the State House Select Committee on Education Working Group. That's a mouthful. Last week, and I believe that was somewhere in the tune of $380 million. That same House committee approved draft legislation last week and recommended it, voted on it, and recommended it for introduction for consideration by the 2020 session of the General Assembly. They did that on Thursday. On Friday, Governor Cooper released a recommended budget to invest $1.4 billion in emergency funds, with most of the source of those funds being the federal CARES funding. And today, the state legislature has returned for their short session with a lot of work to do in a short period of time in a very uncertain landscape, including not just what's immediately amidst us, but also knowing that there are unfinished current needs from the first year or the current year, including compensation changes for many of our staff. One last thing to just bring awareness about, we shared 2 weeks ago the benefit and value of the State Emergency Leave Act. That being said, it concludes at the end of this month, which is the end of this week. It allows workers meeting specified criteria to continue to be paid for leave without having to use their personal annual or sick leave. The state board is meeting this week. We don't know anything definitive, but we hope that there'll be some activity to consider taking action to extend that for our employees. So now I want to switch into the next section. And we talked very briefly about this 2 weeks ago and said we'd come back with additional information. But the current events and having to change how we do business are creating unplanned savings. They're also creating unplanned costs. I want to review some of those with you. And I'm going to roll into this some other directly related things. The proposed budget before you, as I said earlier in the slides, uses more than 50% of unassigned fund balance. At June 30th, that unassigned fund balance was $11.4 million. The proposed budget as it stands right now uses $8.7 million, which leaves, assuming the proposed budget would go forward in that manner, an unassigned fund balance of just under $3 million. Not that much. To give you a sense, I was curious to ask Mark Winters to do a quick calculation for me right before we started. If you look in terms of that unassigned fund balance in terms of our entire $1.8 billion budget, that represents 16/100ths of 1%. 16/100ths of 1% of the total budget. We've also put in spending restrictions that I'll go over in a few minutes that will also generate savings in addition to those other unplanned savings. We also, on the flip side, are seeing losses and reductions in revenue streams that are directly impacting us. So what I hope you see here is this recurring theme of savings and costs in a variety of different areas, and a very low savings account amidst all of that. Unfinished unassigned fund balance will be replenished at the end of the year when and if actual local expenditures exceed actual local revenues exceed actual local expenditures for the year. So let's take a look at what some of the unplanned savings are, and there are others. These are some big categories: substitute teacher pay, professional development and workshop expenses, travel, service contracts. We've cut back. Our schools are not needing the level of custodial contract cleaning that they would if they were being occupied 5 days a week. Service transportation providers, outside providers, diesel fuel, savings for our yellow buses, maintenance parts, supplies. There are a lot of different things. So there are definitely savings. I'll just point out one thing on this screen, though. Not all savings can just be used for something else. Part of that's due to the fact that we have multiple funding sources and they're not all interchangeable. And sometimes the savings aren't in terms of funding, but rather, in this case, in terms of an inventory. Using the diesel fuel as an example, we were, before the shutdown, operating the district using pre-purchased diesel fuel. That's where we pre-purchase it when it drops significantly on the market. We had done that, hindsight being 2020. If we could have predicted the pandemic, we might have waited a little while and gotten an even better price, but we still beat the market at the time. So while we are saving fuel, we're not saving funding. What that means for our future is we would defer a future year's cost. So again, when we look at these savings, there are a lot of complexities associated with it. So it's very important not to just assume that we can use a savings from one of these to apply to a different need. As I shared, we put spending restrictions into place. This went into place, I believe it was last week. These two are designed to generate current year savings. All travel outside of Wake County is frozen. Spending is restricted to essential items only. No pre-purchasing is to be done for a future time period. I'm not going to get into some of the technicalities of this. No carry forward purchase orders are being allowed. We are asking the chiefs to work with their divisions, and basically any purchase orders that we've encumbered for services, goods, that we now consider are now essential and we have not received, we are reversing those encumbrances, which will put the funding back in our unused budget. We're now asking chiefs to approve all of the different documents and requests you see bulleted below. And our central services hiring freeze remains in place with our current restrictions and allowances. And Superintendent Moore and the chiefs have begun a conversation about tightening that up even further. So just as we have savings, we have significant unplanned costs. Developing a myriad of instructional packets and materials. And that includes printing costs, mailing costs, supplies, postage. Perhaps the biggest one in magnitude, the acquisition cost of student and some staff devices and hotspots, contracted services for distribution and deployment of those devices, and monthly service fees for those hotspots. And then another big one that stands out are the one-time and recurring costs it took us to implement the food distribution programs. We did not have all the equipment and materials we needed to put that into place. We have invested in that at this point. Now I'm going to switch over to a loss and reduction in revenue streams that's directly impacting us. So you could look at this loss of revenue kind of like a cost. I already shared with you $3.8 million of funding the state gave us that we are targeting for using to pay CNS staff. We estimate that their fund balance, CNS has a separate fund balance, they're required to have that, will cover their staff through June 30th without receipts. But after that, question mark, and if we want to continue to operate these food distribution services, and then at some point get back into year-round school, all these things to be determined, there won't be any, we'll need staff in place. And again, if the receipts aren't there, we don't currently have a funding source after the fund balance is exhausted. Fines and forfeitures revenue, we get those after the fact, so we don't know what the impact will be there, but the court systems have slowed down significantly. So those revenues, the streams of them, will slow down significantly. There are fewer people driving on the streets. I would have to assume we're receiving fewer tickets, and so those revenue streams will go down. And then parking fee revenues for the current year and community use fees. We're currently in discussion of what we're going to do with them, but assuming we give partial refunds in these areas, that will reduce our current year revenue as well. So to try to pull all that together, yes, there are going to be significant unplanned savings and costs in the current year. The future of state and local funding capacities remain unknown. We don't know what the state may need to do as they revise their revenue estimates for the coming fiscal year and have to make decisions about adjustments to the budgets for those respective organizations, including K-12. Same thing with our county commissioners, they're going through that same process. And based upon what we know at this time, the CARES funds, we believe, should be viewed strictly as a bridge, not as an additional source of funding. I'll recall back again to the Great Recession, the additional federal ARA funds, along with a significant buildup in our unassigned fund balance over several years, are what carried us through as a bridge for this significant reduction in state funding during that same period of time. It's important that any local net revenues, that would be increases in unassigned fund balance, be reserved in unassigned fund balance to manage through these current and future uncertainties. So that was the end of that section. The following slides contain the board members' questions and staff responses. There's also a separate backup document with them, not on PowerPoint slides, but just together on in a PDF for you to review. Again, we wanted to include these in your PowerPoint so they could be included in documentation associated with the presentation. I'm going to flip to one just so you can see what we did. What you see on the right there, that's what's in the other PDF pages of those, the full question and the full response. And then we tried just to give a very high-level glimpse of the response on the left. But again, we're not going to go through those today. So at this time, staff is prepared to answer any additional questions about these slides. And then the last remaining item is to turn it back over to the board for them to begin their conversation, discussion, and direction on any changes to the superintendent and staff on the proposed budget before them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Leader. Does that complete your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sutton.
I know y'all had a little trouble hearing me before. Can everybody hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. We'll turn it over to the board for questions now. I wanted to remind board members to use your hand function so that I can see your hands, and we'll go from there. So Dr. Martin's hand first up. So Dr. Martin, go ahead.
Thank you. And David, thank you for that presentation. I guess my first question, particularly the last section that you dealt with, is the COVID savings and cost. I appreciated, your enumeration of the various areas of challenge. What I would find extremely helpful for thinking about it in the budget context is some numbers associated with that. I know that we can't give absolute numbers, but as we're talking about the budget going forward, I think one of my largest concerns is, what are the numbers that we're talking about? How are we going to see that in light of everything else? So I'm just wondering if there's any way that we can put a little bit more flesh on the bones of the ideas of anticipated costs, so we can look at it in a little bit more of a, pushing toward the spreadsheet fashion. And I know it's not going to be accurate, but I think we need some numbers to get us, in the range of what we're talking about.
Dr. Martin, we can certainly put that together. Based upon what I've seen, my hunch or guesstimate is they're going to net out. They'll net out on the plus saving sides, but not to the tune of anything significant. But we can certainly pull that information together.
I mean, even that is helpful, right? Because I don't know whether this is going to net out on the cost or net out on the plus. I'm glad to hear that you think it's going to net out on the plus for now, because I think once we get restarted, we're going to need those savings, because I think the costs are going to be higher.
Yes, and the reason I state that, based upon what we've looked at so far, the devices, one of the biggest single numbers are the devices for the students and some staff, for our single biggest cost. But again, this is another good example because of funding source. It's not just savings versus cost, it's also funding source. Those devices we used Fund 4 for, so we don't have to net those costs against other savings, for example, and local savings. So in effect, that's a big benefit to us as we look at cost versus savings.
Thank you.
And we'll continue to pull some information together. Point well taken.
That completes your question, Dr. Martin?
Yes, that completes that question. We'll come back to others as we go to more discussion, but others, open it for others.
Sir. Mr. Haggerty, saw your hand next. Haggerty. All right, Ms. Kushner, I saw your hand next, and we'll come back to Mr. Haggerty when he is available.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sutton. I had a few questions, and on question, I appreciated Mr. Nieder, you and the staff answering that list. I think they're very self-explanatory. For question 10, the information on special education teachers and instructional assistants, Chair Sutton, I would like to ask that we work with the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education. She's looking to advocate with advocacy groups so that we can improve that match. So see whatever we can do to add that to our legislative agenda, or have the School Board Association work with that. If you could take a look at that and follow up however we can. in an advocacy way with our special education assistant superintendent. And then some of the questions I posed, I just wanted to underscore. For example, in question number 25, the low per pupil expenditures from the state that our LEA receives. I think it's always important to highlight that Wake County is a district that has a very low per pupil funding coming from the state, and so that the taxpayers of Wake County and North Carolina can see the extraordinary value that our district provides in education, and that if we had more funding, we would really be knocking it out of the ballpark instead of seemingly always having these bare bone budgets, which are frustrating to me as a school board member. But I also appreciate the extraordinary work that goes on given the low level of funding we get from the state. And to that, on 23, that 10-year trend does show what Mr. Nieder referenced in the ARAS money that we had gotten with the last Great Recession. We had pretty flat funding from our commissioners and somewhat from the state, and that stimulus money did carry us over. And while I'm very appreciative that we have the CARES money, we can't afford another 5 years of flat funding. So I'm glad for the assistance that we're getting from these funds. As Mr. Nieder said, these are just a bridge, and we need to make sure that it extends just a year and that we look forward to continuing the upward, that the increases that we have been working so hard to secure from both our local funders, but looking to the state. So with that, I was going to ask Mr. Nieder, if there is additional funding, will we revisit some of those multi-year plans that did take such a cut in this revised budget? And do you foresee any chance of us being able to revisit that so we don't keep falling behind on some of those long-awaited increases?
Very good questions, Ms. Kushner. I think as we learn more in this fluid, evolving situation about the potential for receiving additional funds, we would absolutely look at that. I think first and foremost, we've got to look at our core business, which is learning and teaching in the classroom, whether that be the classroom in a school or virtual classroom, and ensure that that is in its highest form of operation possible. But then after that, as we look at what state funding for this year, this coming year, I should say, looks like, what additional local funding may look like for this year, get a better sense of what the economy looks like. Is this going to be a protracted recession, or should this be a reasonably quick recovery? All those things will help inform, but absolutely those multi-year plans, as I shared, that had been a secondary priority since the Great Recession. It's unfortunate we just started getting out of the gate in the current year, and now coincidentally and unfortunately, we're putting the brakes on again. But absolutely, we'll look at those.
Thank you. And thank you, Chair Sutton. I'll let others chime in. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Haggerty.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry for that glitch earlier. My question follows up on a question that I submitted to staff. To put it in a nutshell, I'm noticing that when it comes to projecting the money from the state government, we are projecting an amount almost $40 million more in additional state money than we actually received last year. And I note that in the budget, we predicted about $30 million more in state funding than we actually
Which number?
received.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, was someone talking? If I can finish my question, I had asked how you justify that higher number, that higher projection of state dollars. And the response that I got back was to look at the budget for all of the ways that that money would be spent. And it's just a reference to the actual funding requests. You know, I'm trying to find out what basis, what rationale do you have for projecting, you know, the $1,046,807 plus dollars from state government? And I'd like an answer to that, please.
Mr. Sutton, I think or whoever's coordinating it, turn it to Gary Kinsey. She's going to respond.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I realize that we responded based on how we estimate the cost be. Hold on one second. We had an echo, so David's going to step out for a second. Okay. When we're building the budget for next year, we assumed that the state would fund us using current state formulas and using next year's student enrollment. We also included the multi-year plan for class size reduction as they implement the program enhancement formula. And we also included some resources that the legislature approved and one of the bills for additional social emotional resources. The other costs that we estimate each year, one is employer matching, retirement, and hospitalization. The General Assembly approved rates for next year in one of their bills this last fall, so we feel confident about that projection unless they make a change now that they're back in session. The one thing that is unknown that we have estimated are salary increases, which is the 2% for certified staff and the 1% for non-certified staff. And that's the way we typically build the state budget. We look at what formulas they may apply and then what are the unknowns. We don't look at it from how their revenue streams may or may not support those figures. That's what we'll see when the General Assembly's in session and they work through the process. So we usually just apply formulas that we know. We look at anything the General Assembly has already approved in a budget or within bills, and then we estimate pay changes that might occur. So I don't know a better way to answer that. So that's how we typically do that, is from the expenditure side.
Okay, Ms. Kinsey, thank you. I appreciate that answer. My follow-up question would be, do you have any basis for projecting a staff increase given the talk of recession and the talk of cuts?
At the time that the superintendent's budget was prepared, which was before the pandemic, we felt that the estimated increases that the state may do with the 2%, 1% were reasonable. Now that we do have the pandemic, I think it's likely that raises could either be zero for next year or it could be less than those projections. We don't know at this time, but definitely the pandemic influences that figure.
Okay, thank you. And that provides more context too at the timing of when these numbers were projected versus sort of the reality we're looking at now. So that explains it, and I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Hagerty. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. Sorry for that delay in unmuting myself. I wanted to build a little bit off of question 15 on page 4. I'm not sure who asked that question, and I read the answer, and I completely understand that we're looking at cuts. We're looking at trying to or not do as much as we had intended on asking for, rather, with this budget, and I certainly respect that. But community members have been asking about the implementation of the Peace Builder program. Is that something that could be piloted at a few schools? Can that work be looked at? And what kind of cost implications. So I was wondering if we could get a little bit more of an answer on number 15 about looking into that. I know that Russ Smith has also been receptive to these discussions, and they seem positive, but just wanted to see if we could get a little bit more information about that and the potential of that program being implemented.
Ms. Scott, this is Paul Coe. I thought I could just jump in and note that, so in terms of the specific question around the Peace Builders program, I think we're looking at it in a braided way along with the other social emotional learning work that we're up to. So Dr. Gardner has reached out to both Dr. Pettiford and myself to explore further about what's possible. We don't have any concrete updates as of yet, but just know that we're working on it. But we think that we don't want to look at Peace Builders in isolation of the other work that we're doing that includes restorative practices. So once we have an update on that, we could provide that to the board.
If I could add, Ms. Scott, there is a projected cost for implementing Peace Builders based on the model as it is out there. And it's not an insignificant amount of dollars, but we are looking, we do want to try to implement that type of work. I'm just not sure that we want to make sure that before that a pilot is still not a standalone, but rather integrated into the other work around social emotional learning and restorative practices that we have going on, which is why Paul and Marius are engaged, as well as Lloyd and Russ. But mostly what I just wanted to point out is that it does have a cost involved depending on how you implement it.
I appreciate all of that. I know I had asked someone for some of the data, the work that's being done at a few of the schools that are really embracing, especially the program from Campbell. And it sounds really successful. So I'm glad to hear that we're going to continue to look to that work. And I respect that it is a cost, but one that is certainly, I'm sure we all agree, worth it. And those are all the questions I had, Mr. Sutton. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Cash.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
In conjunction to maybe what I think Ms. Kushner, and then also in respect to the Peace Builders program. So my first question and what I focused on in this budget is that I think, as we went to get almost full funding that we requested last year from our county commissioners, we did focus on the 5 objectives, the multi-year plans, that we were the 5-year, multi-year, 5 objective plans. I didn't think of that as only something that we were asking the commissioners, but also the fact that I thought that was a real interest and focus of the board, the full Board of Education, that these were areas that we wanted to really tackle. And the fact that I want to be sure, like the Peace Builders, that's $500,000 that we would put towards that instead of in counselors, which is one area that I would want us to be sure the counselors were supported, the purchase of counselors. The other thing I wanted to be sure, and I think there's a page, probably this in the budget, and I just haven't found it, is, the multi-year plan that we asked for. We have cut significantly in every area of that plan. So before I can especially give up counselor positions in the new budget, I would like to look at the areas that we are expanding. There are some positions in central office that we are going to put, is in this budget, and I think some is under our chief, maybe a couple positions there. So before we put positions in our budget that are in the central office, I want to weigh that against the cuts we're making to our counselors in our schools. And how would I do that best? And that's something I wish the board would talk about.
I will just echo that, Mr. Sutton, to Mrs. Cash's point, as I do think it's a conversation I'd like for us to endeavor.
Okay.
I just want to say, as much as I like the position ombudsman, because that's something I've always thought was a really good position. I think I brought it up day one. But that plus the two central positions under chief of schools, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, 'cause with the fact that we cut our multi-plan for our counselors, something we've been talking about for as long as I've been on the board, and probably long before that. I want to weigh that. I would like us to weigh that as a board. That's all.
Okay, I think those positions are part of Superintendent Moore's team and some prep plan. So we'll see if we can talk about that and make sure that that's a topic on our next budget work session. Work.
I will say that other than the things that we are required to do through legislative impact or increased costs that we don't have control over, the largest budget area with any new dollars is the items that are part of the multi-year plan. And it includes less for counselors than what we had hoped to do this year. You are correct, Ms. Cash. But it does include over $1 million in local for that. The same with the maintenance and operations, and the same with the lowest paid and hardest to fill positions. And the K-3 class size impact, the local dollars there. So those areas that were part of our multi-year plan are the bulk of the dollars that are not required in other areas that we don't have choices about. I think what would be helpful perhaps would be to go through the budget and scrub it for the things that you are talking about that are not specifically related to that, to then determine what amount we're talking about and where it might be applied. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that'd be very helpful. That would. I got another question for later, but that would be helpful on that. I just do want to weigh this. Thank you.
Ms. Cash, does that complete your question?
I have another one, but I can wait till others ask theirs first. Whatever you decide, it's fine. I can wait. I'll put my hand back up.
Up to Mr. Fletcher. You have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This seems like we're trying to solve a puzzle without all the rules in place. And while our staff has followed our pattern and relied upon the information that's currently available, the reality is we're going to be amending this budget for the next year as resources change. I mean, the county, the state's not going to, if I had to guess, the state's going to be making changes into July at least. The feds won't adopt a budget until the fall. I think it's wise for us not to expect that any money we get as a grant through the COVID activities of Congress is anything other than a one-time non-recurring funding. And I think there's a challenge that I don't know what the administration has done. I'm sure there's been conversation. But I think we also as a board will need to be involved in conversation about just what does school look like when we reconvene, and what might be the changes that need to be supported financially. Certainly we've gotten into a taste of every student having access, almost every student. We're still not there. We've got some high school students who do not yet have devices. That should be finished out this week, I'm told. And we have students who haven't shown up for class. So, I mean, there are issues with what's going on, But my question would be, and not one for answer right now, but it will be a budget impact on how we do school moving forward. Students need internet access. Students need devices. In the past, we have not provided those. We are now. And what does that look like moving forward? What happens to technology in our schools that in some ways has been redirected for current uses? So I think we've got a lot of unknowns about how will we do school moving forward to assure quality instruction and learning. And that will inform significant budget decisions as we move through the year. And we know that, mid-80s% of our budget is our people. So that means there's not much in our budget that we really have flexible control over, and we can't be very agile with it. So I am really reserving my thoughts about how money might be redirected, waiting for us to have a conversation about what is school going to look like in 2021, and probably trying to predict what it's going to look like in 21-22 as we chart a course to embrace whatever portion of the changes we've gone through in the last months would inform how we do instruction and learning moving forward. So I think staff's presented what they can. I appreciate the comments about counselors. I think the need for support, emotional, social supports when young people come back to us are going to be extreme. It's going to be higher than anything we've seen. It's going to be like a response to a devastating hurricane that lasted for 60 days. And young people, many of our young people are going to be bewildered when they come back to school. So I honor my colleagues' questions and concerns, and also recognize that the superintendent and staff have put together a budget based on what we know today, and tomorrow the data is going to be different. So thank you for what you've done. I do look forward to having a discussion about what school looks like in the future. And I won't say yield my time. That's something they do in the legislature.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher, and I appreciate the sentiment. I will say that staff, superintendent, and chiefs have begun having some of those conversations. Superintendent and I have touched on some of these conversations. Again, I appreciate the sentiment and have shared with Superintendent Moore as well that I think the board is interested in having me a part of some of these conversations as we think about not just what the reopening of school will look like, but again, reimagining what teaching and learning will look like as we move forward. And I think that the point is well taken that those things may very well have and probably will have budget implications. So we'll be thinking about how we move forward with those conversations, be it an additional committee or task force or committee of the whole, talking about that and look forward to providing a way that.
Well, Mr. Chair, in our existing strategic plan, we have really focused on the community engagement concept in terms of having a school district that the community is intertwined with more fully than it has been in the past. And I think this conversation gives us that opportunity to approach it in a new way. And so I look forward to those conversations.
Yes, sir. Forward to them as well. Ms. Mahaffey.
Hi, thank you. I just had two what I believe are quick questions. And first want to echo Mr. Fletcher's sentiments about what school will look like when we go back. I know a lot of our year-round families are looking at the July timeline of what would normally be clopening and are curious whether or not that timeline will shift. And I know we're waiting to hear from the state as to what that will look like for those families. So I had question on activity pay. And I just wanted to, on page 113, I believe this is our last year of this multi-year funding program that began thanks to Ms. Cash, my first year on the board. Is this our final year for extra duty pay, or do we have one more year?
So I believe that we are through, we have completed the extra duty multi-year plan. The dollars that you see represented in that budget case represent, because when we redid the extra duty, we tagged it to the beginning teacher salary. If the beginning teacher salary goes up by 2% or so, as we have anticipated earlier, then this would be the local cost of keeping the extra duty scale benchmarked to the beginning teacher salary. Should there be no raises for teachers, there would be no cost here as well.
Okay.
Other than what's maybe happening with brand new schools.
Excellent, thank you. And my next question was on the.
I'm going to check with Mr. Nieder on whether or not that was sufficiently accurate, or did I leave something?
No, that was completely accurate. It's been completed either a year ago. I believe it reached full completion.
Okay. I was having trouble jogging my memory on that one.
Current year.
And then have we done a breakdown in the local funding of what the per pupil is for all students, including charters, and then exclude what it would look like taking out that charter school money for students in Wake County Public Schools per pupil from the local amount?
We don't have that readily. We can certainly calculate that.
Okay, thanks. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Dr. Martin, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you. And really building off of Mr. Fletcher's questions and comments, I too agree. I think the staff has done a very good job of putting together, you know, for lack of better descriptor, I mean, this is an austerity budget. It's an austerity budget because we know the future is going to be tight, and we've got to work within reasonable bounds. But to follow up a little bit on my initial question, which, you know, was detailing sort of the cost, you know, what is our net cost or savings? I think my concern with the budget, and this is just, there's lots of things I would like us to be able to do, but I'm looking at practical, you know, trying a practical budget. When we come back, I cannot believe that we're not going to have a much greater cleaning demands than we had in the past. And so today, if my memory is right, we're basically cleaning every other day. Now, there are things that are cleaned every day, but my point is the cleaning demand is going to be dramatically increased whenever we reopen, at least for some significant period of time. And so I'm concerned about just the $1 million added, because if my memory is right, it's somewhere $2.3 to $2.5 million per day of cleaning. So that strikes me as a cost that, you know, I like the 5-year plan, but I'm afraid we're going to have to do a faster implementation. Similarly, I'm concerned about nursing. I know that our nurses are provided through the county's Health and Human Services, but, you know, their goal is to have one nurse for every 2 schools. Again, you know, the practical person in me sees a reopening that we're going to have staff taking temperatures regularly, possibly isolating children, any number of things, but the nursing demand, I can't envision a scenario where it's going to be less. And so I really think that we need to think about the reality of having, you know, a nurse, at least one nurse at every school. Some of our large high schools may even require 2. So that strikes me as a huge demand. And I guess the third one that I would highlight as critical We already know that about a quarter of our students are not participating in what is being offered right now. We already have challenges of, disparate access, disparate ability, and it's very challenging for a teacher. And we like to talk about differentiated instruction, but if you're one teacher trying to differentiate instruction for 20 children, that is a non-trivial task. And that task has only been magnified by this time of separation with differential access. So I believe that it's going to be really critical to have more adults working with children in every classroom. Obviously, I would love it if the state would go back to our TA in every K-3 classroom. But if the state doesn't do some of that, what can we do locally? Because I really think at least those three areas, the cleaning, the nursing, and TAs are, I don't see any way we're going to be able to get around those. So how do we start planning today for that? Again, I don't want to take anything away from the great work that the staff has done to put this budget together, but I'm trying to get at the realism of, and we don't even know what it's going to be like, but those are at least three things that I have no doubt are going to be absolutely critical in reopening. So how do we plan now for that?
So I'm going to give you an answer that will give you no comfort, Dr. Martin.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those would be additional costs, right?
Correct.
And on top of the 29 million, or replacing other areas where we have a little bit of flexibility, and there's not a lot, but there's a little bit there. But all of those areas that you mentioned are also pretty consistent with the language that is surrounding a lot of the the COVID funding, the CARES Act funding that's coming down to states and it's coming through DPI that will filter to schools. So they talked about social emotional learning needs of children and additional counselors or nurses during the return to school from the pandemic. As a part and potentially a use of these dollars. We've not seen all of the rules and regulations, but those are some of the things that are swirling around it. Again, though, these are people, and those are generally going to be one-time costs. So it becomes something really interesting, a really interesting dynamic to try to figure out how we can best spend whatever funds we get as a district, knowing that they are likely not recurring, and yet fitting in with what our needs may be. If cleaning is something that's allowed, that would be a great use if it's necessary for some of those funds. The people are going to be a little bit harder. And I think also that when you talk about specifically like nurses, there's a shortage of those in our general population for our healthcare facilities and hospitals and that sort of thing. So there's going to be an issue associated with the actual pool that's available, whether it's nurses or counselors or that sort of thing. I think that's why we sort of looked at it as an incremental growth over multiple years, because we would need that anyway. But what we're looking forward to, quite frankly, is what are the regulations and the rules and the structures behind any additional funding that's made available, and how we'll be able to best utilize it. And we do look forward to bringing that to the board. It's unfortunate that we're sitting in a place right now where we're not able to really commit to either how much or what for. And yet we know the needs are coming, as you have said. So I just wanted to give you some thoughts, knowing that I wasn't going to satisfy the needs.
Well, and I do appreciate that and completely understand, that issue. I guess what I'm thinking, and maybe that's the analytical spreadsheet approach that I often take, is even though I don't know where all those funds are going to come from, because you're absolutely right, they all are additional cost. I think particularly in our communication with our county commissioners and the legislature, if we could put some cost figures to those, this is the scenario of what is, even a conservative, likelihood going forward. If we could if we could articulate these are the costs to do what is almost assuredly going to need to happen, I think that would make it easier to have the discussions with our funders so that people can put it into perspective.
I agree. I think there are multiple sources and places that we can look. There's the state funding that will come and how it will be dispersed. There are the dollars that we already know we will be getting, the 23 to 26 million that we will be getting, and what those options are. I believe that our county is getting almost $200 million that has to be spent by a certain deadline that are for needs arising and related to the impact of the pandemic. So, you know, we're going to look at all of those places.
And I would add, layer on top of that, we're also going to need to see what our needs are if, for example, we don't get flat funding from the state. They do reduce our formulas, or they give us a $50 million discretionary reduction. Or if the county is not able to increase our funding, because effectively flat funding would be a reduction. We're opening new schools, we're adding new students. So those all are competing uses for these one-time funds, as well as competing for any reserves we can build up in our unassigned fund balance.
Absolutely. I guess just want to make sure that kind of what I'm asking for is clear. Right, we projected, for example, what it would cost to have our laptop replacement every 3 years kind of deal, and I think or maybe it was all computer device every 3 years was something like $26 million a year. We estimated if we brought all of our hourly workers up to $15 an hour and whatnot, that was going to be like $35 million a year. Right? We put out the anticipated number. We couldn't do all of that, and that's why we outlined sort of the 5-year plan to get there. So I guess that's where I'm thinking there would be value to say, to get to the cleaning that we anticipate would be needed is going to cost, what, an extra $2.5 million a year, $3 million, I don't know what it is. To get to the nursing level we need will cost this much, and so on. So I'm just thinking that if we could attach a reasonable estimate to the items that we're talking about, I really think that would help conversations.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Staff will take that and we'll work towards that on our next budget work session. Ms. Cushion, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Chair Sutton. I did. I just wanted to augment some of my colleagues' comments. I think if we're looking at, because I do think when we reconvene school, we will need, if we have some one-time funding, I hope we would consider maybe purchasing nursing services, purchasing child psychiatry service, child psychology services, custodial services. If we can't hire people because it is one-time funding, maybe we can look at service contracts, because I do think those are going to be important needs when we reconvene. And also, when it comes to school technology, I really hope that our community, families, and advocates who were wondering why it was so difficult for us to get devices into the hands of some students quickly, there is an outstanding of $730 million from the state that is supposed to have come to LEAs for school tech. We've been waiting on that since the late 90s. So I think there's clearly a failure for the last 2 decades of state leadership in school-related technology that I hope some of our families can work with us to advocate for greater state leadership when it comes to technology. I don't think technology is going to replace the schoolhouse. I think that's been underscored certainly in this quarantine and the closing of our school buildings, just how important it is for us to gather. I saw something today that said if your ideal virtual learning will have a teacher-student contact every day. And I can't imagine a high school teacher or a middle school teacher having to contact every student every day one-on-one. That's just, it shows how efficient a classroom is in instruction. So not to keep going down a sidebar, but I just wanted to underscore that there is additional, underscore that there's additional need for state leadership in getting a school tech. And the North Carolina School Board Association has got a great package of advocacy if folks want to find that online and join with the School Board Association to advocate for school systems.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. Mr. Hagerty.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sutton. Just a very quick question. I notice in new and expanded programs, this is a very, very modest, very brief section. There is a section about increased spending for magnet schools. And I want to make sure that I understand this. Is this tied to the magnet grant that we've applied for the funding at Dillard Drive and some other schools where, and then if we didn't have this money in the budget, would that jeopardize that federal money that we're eligible for the magnet grant?
Terry's going to handle that one if we can.
Can you? So on the first magnet case, which is on page 127, those dollars are needed for the magnet and curriculum enhancement theme development. And that's unrelated to the new magnet grant that we're applying for. So those dollars are needed for the Broughton Global Studies and Language Immersion program.
Mm-hmm.
And then Centennial University's Connections and Leadership Magnet Middle School program. The funding request on page 128 is the one that if the magnet grant is funded, it would free up this local request. But we've had to put the local request in case we don't get the magnet grant. We would need these resources for the commitments we've made for those magnet programs at Dillard Drive Elementary, Dillard Drive Middle, and East Cary Middle School.
Okay, great. I knew that we had some local money that we would have to allocate for it. I didn't understand how that would work with the grant. So that explains that. That explains that for me fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hagerty. Ms. Cash.
Thank you. I just have a couple things. I would hope, again, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but as a healthcare provider, as much as I like nurses in our school, I think our SEL needs is going to be a whole lot bigger than our health needs. If our governor opens our schools and we're still we're supposed to check their temperatures before they come in, we shouldn't be open at that point. So hopefully, I don't think we could ever take care of something like that. So nurses, as much as I like them in our schools, I'm still more concerned about our counselors. And the thing that I would say is we need to start pressuring our legislature a whole lot more. We gave these objectives last year, and they were costed out to our local providers of commissioners, and they took us on that word for that. So for us to put out another information piece of how much nurses would cost or how much this would cost with local dollars, and we haven't even really tackled our multi-plan that we gave them that we still feel very strongly about, I think is going to get confusing. I would like to just focus on the 5 objectives we've given to them and not give them any more costs on items that we should be really, really working harder to put that burden back on our legislation. That's more of a comment than a question.
If I could just add to that, Ms. Cash, when I was talking about costs, I was not saying where the funding would come from, whether it would come from the local sources or state sources or what, right? And whether it's nurses or counselors, social workers, we can make lots of arguments for that, cleaning, TAs, any of those kind of things. These are things that are going to need to be done. And whether it's state sources or local sources or what, we're not the ones to necessarily decide that, but these are real costs that I believe we're going to incur when we reopen.
I understand that, and I agree. I see what you're saying, and I don't want to add so much to this request all the time that we start to lose the things that we really thought we were going to make a dent in. But I understand what you're saying. I do think nurses are helpful for our schools. I think they're really helpful. I don't think they're going to be needed any more post-COVID than they were pre-COVID. And again, for me, this is hard to say as a healthcare provider because the health needs to me are what I put my life on all the time, but I am really worried about our social emotional learning and what's going to happen on that. I think they're going to come back. Kids are going to come back with a lot of concerns and problems. So just an emphasis, but I get what you're saying, Dr. Martin. I understand what you're saying. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. Appreciate the comments. I think all comments are well taken, and this conversation will continue to evolve just from where we were the last 2 weeks, and now with additional guidance coming from the CARE stimulus funding, and we'll continue to receive more information on that and how we can use that. So we will continue these budget work sessions. It also underscores the need to have some real discussions about what the reopening of schools and reimagining what education would look like as we move forward. So thank you for those comments. We will continue to explore and delve in. I don't see any other questions regarding the budget at this time. So with that, we'll close the budget work session. Are there any other final comments? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to our next agenda item.
Mr. Sutton?
Yes.
I apologize. I was muted. I was trying to get in. Do you mind if I just say a couple of closing things about the budget? Well, just to clarify and to give context, although it is the entire district's operating budget, including all funding sources, the requirement to get it to the county commissioners no later than May 15th is, one could say, is the local funding portion of the budget, but you can't have part of a budget. So my suggestion to the board would be to focus on that component of it as you pull things together. The legislature's just come back into town today, so it's really the local funding component that is the target of completing out this piece. The state component that's working with the state legislature and whatever they finally do will make its way back into a budget, a Wake County Public School System budget. And as far as schedule, and this is the last thing I wanted to add, currently you're scheduled for one more work session 1 week from today, May 5th, at which you're currently scheduled to vote on approving a proposed board's budget. So our goal was, for a week from today, we would be presenting any changes that you are directing. When I say you, the board members are directing superintendent and staff to make, and we would bring those back to you for review at your May 5th meeting. That being said, if additional work sessions are required, they can certainly be scheduled.
Thank you, sir, for that. And
thank you.
I look forward to our next session a week from today. Again, I encourage board members to consider those questions, and we'll submit those in the same format that we took those for this session continue that work in the next week to come. All right, moving to our next agenda item, which is the initial planning for the 2021-2022 school enrollment plan. I think that is Wade Martin, Dr. Wade Martin and staff team working on that.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, board members, and Superintendent Moore. While COVID certainly has us wondering what the school year may look like next year, Mr. Carroll and I would like to begin our work with the board today in looking at our 2021-22 enrollment plan. During the work session today, we will be seeking the board's feedback and direction regarding some potential items to be included in the initial plan, as well as a suggested timeline for this work. At this time, I will turn it over to Mr. Carroza, who will walk us through the presentation as we gather your feedback.
Chair Sutton, members of the board, how are you?
Doing well, sir. How about you?
Just getting ready to share my screen. And can everyone see the slideshow?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so thank you for having us today. We're planning to have a brief discussion about the upcoming 21-22 enrollment plan. Staff is not expecting answers today, but we are trying to generate some questions and some talking points that staff will then follow up with you at a later date for further discussion. So what will be discussed? We've got a new school opening in 21-22. As usual, we'll discuss capped and overcrowded schools for 2020 and 2021. We'll look at policy 4150 and looking ahead, your work with RTI. We're proposing a hybrid multi-year enrollment plan, and we'll get into that a little bit further, and then any additional items that should be considered. So the new school that's opening in 21-22 is Willow Spring High School. You remember we went through this last year in the enrollment plan, and we had shown the base attendance area for this school. Just as a reminder, the school is opening on a traditional calendar. It's got a capacity of 2,246 students. It will open with grades 9 and 10 only. And the impacted areas were Fuquay High School, Holly Springs High School, and Middle Creek High School. And in case you didn't remember, here is the before and after maps. The map on the left shows the colored current base attendance areas. The purplish color in the north would be Middle Creek High School. The salmon color to the south would be Fuquay High. And the blue-gray to the west would be Holly Springs. Keeping those same colors, but adding yellow would be the new proposed base attendance area for Willow Spring High School. And again, this was what you voted on last year, just as a reminder, if there's any additional discussion you'd like to have around this moving forward. So CAP schools. These are the elementary schools with an enrollment cap for 2020-2021. I've highlighted the schools in green, which were added for this school year, or the upcoming school year for that matter. We have 5 new ones. These are the middle schools and high schools with an enrollment cap. No changes here from last year. And then we have some overcrowded schools that have concerns. Douglas Elementary, Jeffries Grove, Joyner, all being magnets, which do offer the staff some flexibility with regards to enrollment numbers at the schools. Lacey Elementary had a recent surge in their kindergarten population, so we are trying to monitor that situation to find out what's happening with their continued growth, if there is any. Northwoods Elementary, we're bringing that. We had some concerns about modular units being placed on the campus in time for school to start. So we may not have the capacity that we had expected, so we will further discuss that with you as we move forward. And then middle schools, Carroll Middle School and Fuquay Middle School. Carroll, again, is a magnet, so we do have some flexibility when dealing with that school. Fuquay Middle School we had addressed in last year's plan, as well as we have a future school opening, Herbert Akins Middle School, which would provide some relief. And then Apex Friendship High School, again, looking ahead to some future schools, we do have some relief coming with the school H12 in the Holly Springs area. So I just wanted to remind you about policy 4150. Operational efficiency, proximity, stability, and student achievement are the drivers of this policy and the student assignment plan. And thinking about that, considering your work that's happening with RTI moving forward and the timeline that you have with them, staff thought it may be a better idea to provide some sort of a hybrid enrollment plan. Feedback has been very good over time with regards to doing a multi-year plan, providing more of a runway for parents to understand and make decisions, especially with childcare, as they plan for the upcoming school years. So in trying to stay consistent with that, staff has looked at possibly doing a hybrid where we won't show exact maps of the new base attendance areas. We won't have any proposed base attendance areas, but we can show impacted areas. So while we won't have detailed maps, we can have maps that show maybe a shaded area of the likelihood of families being affected through a reassignment, should all the factors stay or remain about the same when it comes to the policy. You know, as you start to look at possible policy revisions, staff felt it may be best, you know, with schools opening in 22, 23, that we wait for that policy to be finalized first before we start to establish new base attendance areas according to this policy. Again, no maps or data would be presented in the traditional sense, but we will have some visuals for families. We will have ways to reach out to families to let them know that they could possibly be impacted, invite them in on the discussions, whatever those may be, look like as we move forward. But we will have some outreach to families so that we can get feedback from them as well. So I asked this question, and I don't need specific answers today because, like I said, staff will follow up. But are there any other items that the board feels that should be considered in the initial enrollment plan as we start to develop draft one? And I'll open it up to you now.
Thank you, Mr. Carroza.
Can I think my hand didn't ever go down. Now it's still up, but I still have a question. Sorry.
All right, we'll start with you, and then Ms. Mahaffey.
I'm sorry. I just, my biggest thing about is this what we want to look at. Is there anything else? Now, I think because of the coronavirus, we came to a fairly sudden stop on the RTI work that we were doing. And so when you look at page 9 of the presentation you're doing, I'm not quite sure operational efficiency is clear to me what that means. Does that mean the health of the school? Does that mean the capacity? We've probably talked about this before, and I just haven't I just maybe not have embedded it in my mind exactly what operational efficiency is, because just looking at this plan, this is a bigger discussion, and we may not be able to have it, but considering the fact that after this plan is voted on, I'm not sure how many of the current board members necessarily will continue. I didn't know at what point we were going to look at whether the 4 pillars are the pillars that we want to stay with. Is that too big of a question for this, or? Because I'm really hoping that some of the diversity conversation would happen in this student assignment plan. I think that maybe I'm saying that not necessarily for student assignment people, but maybe as chiefs as a whole. I think the diversity piece is something I would continue to like to look at. And this a plan.
Ms. Cash, we will continue those discussions, particularly the work with RTI. We're not stopping that. Work has been going off just a little bit because of the pandemic, but that work will continue.
I actually knew that. I knew it was no reason of any of ours or anybody in leadership that stopped, because that's just the way it had to be. But again, this plan is going to be voted on fairly soon, and I don't know whether we should have that is one of our goals in operational efficiency is diversity. That's my question.
I think staff can chime in. I think operational efficiency in this regard is the same as it has been in our previous 4 pillars. So we've not changed that definition of operational efficiency with respect to overcrowding, undercrowding, and those kinds of things. Now, again, work around RTI includes that work around.
You're correct, Mr. Sutton.
Yeah, achieving healthy, balanced schools. But for the purposes of this slide and this presentation today, operational efficiency is the same as the original definition.
That is correct.
Does that answer your question, Ms. Katz?
I think maybe yes, maybe no. Let me think about that answer.
Okay. Ms. Mahaffey.
Hi, thank you. In regards to the hybrid multi-year enrollment plan on slide 10, I'm excited to see this being brought forward as multi-year enrollment plans were something that we had been talking about when I first got on the board, and then K-3 class size legislation hit, and it was all hands on deck for figuring out how we were going to be in compliance with that mandate. My question is, as the team moves forward into what a hybrid enrollment plan would look like, what is the communication plan for families, just to let them know that this is something that we're trying?
So I believe staff, sorry.
Go ahead.
I believe in discussions with senior leadership, we've talked about not changing the fact that we will continue that outreach to families, through social media, through the email that we generate. We will still try to find a potential impact area and reach out to those families. They just will not know with 100% certainty if they would be impacted or not with the actual drawing of the attendance lines, because with regards to if there are any policy changes, we wouldn't want to recommend those attendance areas at this time.
Right. So, well, what I'm saying is, how do we let the entire district know that this is a change? Because I think this is something a lot of parents have been asking for, is if only we had more time to prepare for this change. Childcare was referenced. I know calendar changes can be difficult for a lot of families who are either going from year-round to traditional or vice versa when it comes to summer camps or track-out camps. Just showing like, hey, we've taken the feedback that you've given us, and here's what we're going to be trying for this coming school year, I think would show parents that we're listening. Just as before, we didn't used to send parents an email saying that the enrollment plan was being addressed, and they only received an email after that first work session. So I think the more communication we can put forward ahead of time, just to let folks know what the changes are, I think would be proactive and helpful. I appreciate identifying those areas and making them be maybe a little bit larger and more abstract, because we don't know what the exact base for the new school would look like. But I think the more information that we can give to families when it comes to such a uncertain time when they're dealing with that would be helpful. So thank you.
And we'll continue to follow up with communications to make sure that that gets out as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Mahaffey. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. Adding on to what Ms. Mahaffey was saying about the areas that may be impacted, and looking at those ahead, there's been a lot of new growth in Wake Forest and in Eastern Wake, and particularly around Beaver Dam Elementary. There's very large developments that are filling in, and while there is of course the potential that would slow down because of if we have a recession, I'm still concerned about those areas, and I was really pleased and very thankful. We had a Wake Forest Town Commissioner reach out to get more information about schools, and I hope that, and I know others share this thought, but I do hope that we can sort of develop some sort of protocol for having these discussions when a new large development, something, how is that on the radar of student assignment? Because in Wake Forest, we do have space in some schools that's going to involve a reassignment for those schools, and having that heads up, it's definitely complicated, and I'm glad it's not my job to figure out those numbers, but the communication with not only just the community, but trying to have some sort of working conversation, either a protocol in place where we do hear from our municipalities and have that ongoing discussion is going on with them. So I was wondering, it's not really part of the enrollment plan, but certainly part of the work that you all do, Mr. Martin, in your office and your planning. And I guess I'm just sort of asking, how are we looking at that when we have a Beaver Dam Elementary that is capped, and there's lots of growth happening around it? How are we communicating with some of our other municipalities outside of Wake Forest?
Ms. Scott, Mr. Martin here. We have started some processes with some of our other municipalities, Apex specifically, where their planning staff is sharing proposals as they get presented to the town, and are involving myself as well as Mr. Croz's office. And now we will be bringing Ms. Rory as our long-term planner into that process to seek feedback on what the impact may be for the surrounding schools, so that the town planning staff can be up to speed and understand the impact that it may have on the surrounding schools. That will also involve allow them with the ability to share with community stakeholders from their perspective as well what potential impacts may be. As we start to have these multi-year plans that could potentially impact reassignment or calendar changes, I think the sooner that all of the stakeholders in those areas are informed about those possibilities and data around that, the better that we all will be. So we've just recently in the past few months started a fairly succinct process with some of the municipalities that we hope to extend that working relationship to the Wake Forest Town Planning Department, coming out of that the recent email and that exchange that we had with this one new neighborhood. So we're looking forward to that relationship, and we understand how important that is going to be moving forward, understanding that not only are there public school choices, but families have lots of choices in the Wake Forest area. So the closer that we can collaborate with the town planning staff, I think the better off we'll all be.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, for Mr. Martin for that response. Dr. Martin.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the idea of moving toward this kind of a hybrid, because as we've talked about for quite a while, the further out we can get in any of these assignment discussions, the better it is for the community. But in that regard, I share some of Ms. Cash's concern that, you know, there's a lot of these issues that we've been talking about for a very long time. And obviously we have not seen fully what is going to be presented. But I'm concerned that, again, we've got kind of the mechanics of student assignment when we've got a lot of work to do, you know, with some of the bigger issues. You know, if we're going to get, as we've talked about, to not change calendars more than a year and a half ahead of time, so families don't just have kind of, 6 months, we're going to have to find a way to deal with a different calendar in July. You know, if we make those decisions in 1 year for not the following year, but the next school year, that requires long-term decisions. So that means if we're going to do anything with calendar in 2 years, we need to be thinking about it this year. And so I'm just a little concerned, you know, I want us to get to this you know, longer term approach, but that means we need to be thinking early strategically. You know, same thing, well, with the calendar, we still haven't come up with our calendar principles. And I think if we could come up with our calendar principles, we would be in a whole lot better shape than we are right now. That it feels a little haphazard. You know, we talked some years ago about dealing with track 4 and multi-track year-round schools. I mean, we're not getting the financial benefit. So should we even have track 4s? You know, should there be some kind of a capacity trigger that says once you pass this, then you go to year-round, otherwise not? These are decisions that we need to make, and they need to be part of our enrollment plan. I mean, they don't have, I guess, the urgency that opening a new school does, but my question is sort of, when are we going to do this? Same issue as Ms. Cash raised about diversity issues. You know, we talk around it, but, you know, we're going to need to look at the downtown schools because with gentrification, they've changed. We've got several areas throughout the county where we need to look at those kind of issues. When are they going to get into our discussion? You know, we also started to talk about the attractiveness of schools issue. Maybe that's leadership. Maybe that's, you know, some cosmetics. Maybe it's programming. There's a number of things that go into that, you know, because we need every school to be a school that we would want to send our children to. You know, and so I guess part of my question is, how do some of those other factors get involved into our assignment plan discussion? Yes, it's the RTI work, but it also has to be, you know, made real, made tangible. So is that going to come in at all this year, or are we going to just sort of do okay, we're opening a new school, we have to change these boundaries? So I guess it's that long-term approach that I think I'm sharing the same concern that Ms. Cash tried to articulate. So how was some of that going to get worked in this year? Because if we're doing long-term planning, we got to be making decisions this year for 2 years out.
So I think the purpose of this discussion is to tease out some of the items that you'd like us to consider moving forward. And staff will continue to follow up with you as we move forward to get additional feedback as well. Also, I just want to clarify something about this hybrid multi-year enrollment plan. I think staff's in favor of doing a multi-year enrollment plan like we've done the last 2 years with Southeast Raleigh Elementary and then Willow Spring High School. I think this year we looked at scaling it back a bit only because of the timeline with the policy discussion. And so otherwise, under normal circumstances, we would be moving forward with a multi-year plan like we've seen the last 2 years. So I don't think we're trying to change it in that sense. I think we are trying to provide that longer runway, that 18-month runway for families with calendar changes. So I think we'll continue that. I think just this particular year, we looked at trying to scale it back a bit, just with the uncertainty of what was going to happen. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
No, I think to a degree, and I guess I hear you asking for what other things, and so I would like to see staying active in our discussion, specifically calendar diversity and attractiveness of schools. I don't know what that will turn out to be, but those, I think, are things that need to be in the forefront of our discussions.
Dr. Martin, this is Wade Martin here. Thank you for that input, and that's the kind of feedback that we were hoping for. With the original RTI timeline, they would be facilitating what was planned for June into July, that the conversation around the possible revisions to policy 4150. I believe one of the big points that you brought up, the idea of the multi-track calendar capacity triggers. Given that year-round schools and that process was one of the main work session topics that we talked about, that is something that would have been involved in that policy conversation. So I think that is on the horizon. We are just looking to reset this timeline with RTI, but those factors that you just talked about are ones that certainly are on our radar that we hope to work into that conversation and discussion with the board.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just add to that, yeah, I think before we were on a timeline where we would have been making those decisions that would then fit right into this process. That timeline now has been thrown off just a bit. And we're trying to see if we can accelerate some of that to make some of these decisions in time to go into this plan. I think just understand that things are a little bit off, and we're just trying to sort of realign and reconfigure those timelines to see if we can still get those decisions made so that they might fall into this multi-year enrollment plan. Ms. Cushman.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. For Mr. Carosa, I wanted to ask for a couple of additional groups of data. One, I would be interested in knowing how many transfers are at the schools, both the capped schools and the schools that we're looking at, reassignments going forward. And then in addition to the transfers that are in some of those schools that you have crowding concerns, because I would think we should address that before we do any assignment changes to those crowded schools. And then if you could, on the maps, superimpose some of the high growth areas and where you are expecting growth to be, just so we can have that layered onto those maps, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. In the interest of time, what I will do is I will just email my specific questions to staff, but in advance of that, I did want to see if I could get a request. I know we're going to have some more conversations leading up to the enrollment plan. If we could get updated facilities utilization data that we could use to look at for what your projections are for 2020, 2021. And then the other suggestion I'll just leave, especially with some of this RTI work, is that one thing we as a board might want to consider, if staff has the time for it, and I know everyone's being pulled in a million different directions, is maybe look at a meeting in June or May, a virtual meeting if necessary, just to try to get back on track with some of these RTI discussions. Thank you.
Mr. Haggerty, Mr. Martin here. I would share with you that Ms. Rory, her very first item that she is tackling is that facility utilization report. She understands how critical that is to the work of the board as well as to the work in Glenn's office as they review transfers. So that is priority one that she has already begun work on. So I will look for that from her shortly to be able to share with the board and get that updated data, because it's certainly critical to the decisions that you all make.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson-Haas.
Thank you. So Dr. Martin actually brought up several of the points for me, which was reminding, I guess, staff that, part of our work with RTI also included not just the diversity work, but also what this looks like for the ever-changing Wake County, specifically with gentrification. What does that mean for our schools? And excuse me, in addition to how we make them appealing. But I guess the other thing that I'll continue to reiterate that I've said before is when we're making these changes, and I just think it's important that, of course, this isn't our fault. Timing is everything. But the reality is we continue, and several board members have said it here, is our concerns about multiple changes for families. And so while of course we have to open new schools and make changes, I just want to reiterate my concern to making changes when we still know that the diversity changes are upon us, and I don't want to see this. I don't want this to be a reason that we put off the work we're doing because we would have families changing schools potentially 1 to 2 years back to back. And I don't know the answer to that, but I just think we have to be cognizant of making changes, of course, outside of new schools that could then potentially those families could experience change again. Not in our policy, but definitely has been this board's practice to be considerate of how frequently we're changing folks at schools.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostin. We are capturing these notes and sentiment for our discussions with the RTI. Again, those conversations are continuing with them. All of these points are well taken as we continue our discussions with them, and again, try to adjust our timeline with this plan. Ms. Mahaffey.
Yes, hi. So as we're talking, I'm hearing a lot of different ideas come up as to what this hybrid plan can look like. And I just had a moment and thought, we haven't finished our work with RTI, so I'm a little hesitant to say that we're applying the principles that we're doing with RTI into this until we've fully sorted those out and worked through that process, not just with the folks from RTI, but with our community as well. And so although that's something for sure I'd like to see in the long term, I don't know if for this upcoming enrollment plan for 2021, if that's appropriate. That's my comment.
Mine, okay. Mine, no. Looney, no.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Mrs. Cash, did you have another comment, question?
No, mine.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Martin, for talking about some items like the calendar and the diversity and the attractiveness of schools, meaning also leadership that might be in the schools. There was a piece of information that I wanted to request, and I think I requested prior to the fact that we had the coronavirus and the RTI work stopped, but I think we could still use it as we're looking at the plan, and that was the information about our magnet program as we have it now. What percent of those seats are actually, what percent are magnet seats that are filled in our magnet schools, and what percent of the magnet seats that are filled in our magnet schools are priority one. I really would like to know that as we look at this assignment plan, and I think that might be helpful. We're putting some more extra dollars into an expansion of our magnet program, and I want to be sure it's, again, choice with a purpose for our system.
Ms. Cash, Mr. Martin here. We will certainly work to get that data available to the board as we continue to move this conversation forward.
Were there any other items that the board wanted to discuss?
I see a few hands. I think they're residual hands, Ms. Hegarty, Ms. Johnson-Hobson, did you have another question? Ms. Mahaffey?
I don't. Sorry about that, Mr. Sutton.
No problem.
Same
No,
up to
sorry.
you. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Martin and Mr. Carrozza, for that initial update of our plan. Did you, okay, you got one more slide here with the timeline?
Yeah, just one more slide. I wanted to share with you a proposed timeline. So looking at the timeline that we have used previously, we're looking at a draft one being released to the public on September 15th. Again, we would open the online feedback portion. We would respond to questions and answers. Info sessions would happen somewhere between September 17th and October 1st, the actual dates and locations to be determined. Draft 2 would go to the board during the work session on October 20th. Again, continuing with feedback online. And then a public hearing on November 10th. This is assuming that the first board meeting in November, which in an election year generally gets pushed back to the second week. So this would be the first board meeting of the month. And then you could do a final vote on either November 17th or the 24th. The 17th would require calling a special meeting. It's the third Tuesday of the month. However, if we're going to a 2-4 pattern that month due to the election, we could push it to the 24th. So, and then grandfathering for families would start in early December. So I just wanted to give you a proposed timeline to figure out, you know, when items would be coming to the board in case you had any additional feedback. And just a reminder, we did push this up like we had 2 years ago, where a final vote was in November prior to the new board taking office, if there are any new board members.
All right, thank you, sir. Any final questions, comments, or thoughts?
Yeah, this is Lindsay. Glenn, the Willow Springs High School's families that have already gotten their assignment this past round, that December date would be their opportunity to grandfather, correct?
That would be correct. And we would notify families again that are impacted and who are eligible for grandfathering. We would contact them again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carrozza, Mr. Martin, for that presentation.
Thank you so much.
That will take us now to our next agenda item, which is a COVID-19 update. Superintendent Moore.
Hello again. So as we have done now for several weeks, we started out first in the board meeting, but in the work session, we want to include every time we meet an opportunity for the board to hear firsthand some of the changes that are coming, some of the celebrations, some of the continued challenges, the work that's happening around our COVID-19 response. We do have a number of updates for you today based on the landscape continuing to change and different policies and processes being brought forward by other parts of the State Department of Public Instruction, the governor, that sort of thing. I'm going to turn it over now to Edward McFarland, who will introduce the update for the board.
So good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board. This is our third Board of Education meeting where we have shared COVID-19 updates since the shutdown of our schools on March 13th. Our goal from the beginning of school closures has been to provide continued learning for all of our students and to keep you, the board, updated regularly about our progress. At the March 23rd meeting, we shared with the board about phase 1, which was the creation and delivery of the remote learning resources site, student community outreach, and professional development for our staff. At the April 14th meeting, we shared phase 2 with the board, and that was the details of remote continuous learning, providing timelines, classroom expectations, student engagement, and really some specific examples of elementary, middle, and high school schedules. In addition, a grading update with regard to our seniors was presented at that meeting. We've also shared that remote learning depends on internet connectivity, and we are working to provide consistent access to the internet and devices at home. Also, we continue promoting the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, PBS, and UNC partnership as an additional method that we support through weekly reminders and posting lessons and activities on our remote learning resources site. And finally, we began the distribution of general learning packets last week. This will continue over the next couple of weeks as we seek to connect and engage with every single student during this pandemic quarantine. From the beginning, we have acknowledged there is a significant difference between remote instruction and face-to-face interactions in the classroom. However, we do believe the resources we are providing, combined with the outstanding efforts of our teachers and schools and the work they are doing every day, continues to support the very best of continuous learning under the stay-at-home order. We will, however, keep working to get better every day. One example you may even hear about this afternoon is how our adaptive PE teachers and staff are creating very specific videos and choice boards to be used by parents and our adaptive physical education students. So the purpose of this presentation today is really to provide more in-depth, detailed information about how we are working to provide special education services and support our students' social and emotional needs in a remote learning environment. In addition, as we continue receiving almost daily information, updates, and guidance from the North Carolina State Board of Education and the Department of Public Instruction, we are going to share an overview of the most recent grading guidelines that were released last week. So here with me this afternoon sharing the special education services in a remote environment is Karen Hamilton, the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education Services. Social Emotional Learning Information, Paul Coe, the Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services. North Carolina State Board of Education Grading Policy Update, Drew Cook, the Assistant Superintendent for Academics. As before, our team is going to provide 3 separate, about 8 to 10 minute presentations, and then we will pause after each presentation for dialogue and questions from the board. So we're now set to begin with Special Education Services and Assistant Superintendent Karen Hamilton.
Good afternoon. Thank you for letting me join this afternoon's conversation. I want to talk about what special education services in a remote learning environment might look like. Or not might look like, is looking like. I also want to emphasize that special education services now do not look the same that they did on March 13th. Special education services in a remote learning environment are based on students' IEPs, but they are also considered to be comparable and proportionate. So it's important to remember that students with disabilities first are general education students, and then they receive special education services. And as you know, each school schedule has been abbreviated and everybody's school day has been altered. So when teachers are developing what special education services will be provided, they begin first with the school day. Of course, if students have the ability to access general education activities, we want them to do that. And special education services should be comparable and proportionate in light of circumstances. And when I say in light of circumstances, those are the circumstances that are afforded through the abbreviated school day, the altered learning activities, the ability of the family and the student to engage in learning activities in a remote environment, and the ability of the teacher, given that they are also teaching in a remote learning environment, perhaps with their own children at home, have the ability to deliver. After teachers take a look at where students were on March 13th and they look at IEP goals that might be accessible through remote learning and what might be accessed in a comparable and a proportionate day, they're going to develop how and when they would provide those services. And then they're going to communicate with parents. And they are going to communicate by phone, by email. They're going to lay out what this special education learning will look like, give parents an opportunity to provide feedback. And after they establish that, that's going to be the remote learning plan for the student. Of course, that can be altered if parents communicate with teachers and we find that we need to make adjustments, but that's how the learning opportunities are going to progress. And as with general education teachers, our special education teachers have office hours where they're contacting students, and also that gives them the availability to talk to parents as well. It's important once we have established what a learning plan is going to be that we document that. And since our general progress monitoring is not going to be in effect when we're collecting robust points against specially designed instruction, we do need to document the teachers are providing the instruction outlined in the learning plan and what student responses are to those activities. And we've developed and deployed just a simple sheet for teachers to identify that information and to locate it. It's important, of course, because they need information on students' progress to determine what they're going to be teaching next. But they also need to make a determination when all of this is over is to, like what learning loss has occurred for students and where we need to begin any extended school year services or where we would begin the next school year once we return to brick and mortar. So after we know what we're going to be doing with students, or simultaneously to know what we're going to be doing with students, we need to scale up what special education teachers will be providing and how they know what to provide and how they access the information that's out there for them. So of course, we have a presence on the remote learning system that is part of the district system, and all of this information can be found there by teachers. We have presented webinars on the compliance end of things, how to conduct virtual IEP meetings, how to conduct the kinds of things where we're assessing, where we would do evaluations in a virtual and remote setting. We also have scaled up webinars for how do teachers access the material, how do they provide it to children with disabilities. And as Edward said, that can look a number of ways. We have our adaptive PE class that is pushing out very, very active choice boards to kids who have significant challenges. And we have teachers who are also co-teaching in learning situations that are provided by general education teachers and remote learners. So it runs the gamut. So those webinars have addressed what learning plans should look like, what learning logs should look like. We've received feedback and we are adjusting that. And we have also provided webinars on just how to provide instruction and how to collaborate. I send out a central level message about once a week. And the real meat on the bones are the senior administrators and the coordinating teachers who are working with individual teachers, with school PLTs who are developing these instructional videos and actually consulting with teachers on a daily basis to make sure that as they're scaffolding their skills into remote learning, they've got good resources to rely on. For our extended content students, we mailed instructional packets to every student who receives services through the extended content. We provided messaging for parents in those packages, and I also provided a message via school messenger to each one of those families. Our extended content kiddos face some additional challenges. Some kids are unable to participate in a remote learning environment at all. They can do it in an even more abbreviated fashion, and we wanted to put these materials, these packet materials, into the hands of parents should they want to look at other activities. And of course, teachers who are making contact with parents will provide support and information for those parents around the activities that are in the instructional packets. So who's getting service? Who's out there, how do we find them, and how do we make sure that we're providing service? So the first thing we're doing is seeking to provide services to all students with IEPs, and that also includes related services for all kids who are entitled to those services. Our preschool students who have been served in developmental day programs are continuing in a remote learning environment with developmental day support, and that's with students, and because they're preschool kiddos, it's also with their families. Students who have previously been served on home hospital have either been incorporated back into their school environment, and we have a handful of kids who have some long-standing relationships that we are continuing to provide those services for. And our students who have been served in evening programs have been incorporated into the Infinity program and are also receiving remote services. So special education and a remote learning environment has some challenges and has some barriers. Like students in general ed, we have kids who don't have accesses to devices and have poor connectivity issues. Those students have been included when principals have been making requests for devices and for hotspots. So that's nice that that is part of the whole school foundation for learning. But with disabilities, some disabilities bring some larger challenges, and that in itself can be that a student can't utilize a device if they have it, or that their ability to maintain attention in remote learning is diminished because of their disability. Our teachers are working to contact parents of students with more challenging disabilities, help to think about and generate activities that can be supportive during the time of remote learning, and to maintain connections with students and families. As we move forward to the end of remote learning, however the beginning of the next school year should look, we'll need to consider, did we provide services? And in the instances that we didn't provide, and which would be very few, what compensatory services we might need to offer. And we'll also need to look at extended school year. An extended school year addresses learning loss, typically over a summer. So we would want to take a look at what learning loss do we expect that most students will be experiencing, if any, during a period of remote learning, how that impacts students with disabilities, and will that require additional extended school year services. And I do think that's going to be true, and I think that's going to be a large area for us to consider. And then as we are scaffolding up for remote learning, we are also working to plan what does that look like for students with disabilities when we return. We have some kids who will slide right back into school, but we have kids whose patterns of learning have been interrupted, their routines have been interrupted, and it will be very challenging for them to move from home and back into school. So I hope this overview has been helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. I don't see any hands at this point, so we can just go ahead with our next.
So Paul Coe's up next.
Okay, hold on one second. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. I did just have a quick question. When we're looking at students who are receiving, and thank you for all this information, Ms. Hamilton, by the way, but when we're looking at students who might be accessing a separate speech therapist or occupational therapist, what is that looking like right now for someone who works with a special education teacher, but also who their IEP might also have them working with other types of specialists?
Sure. And just to clarify, we're talking about related service providers like speech, OT, PT.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So the same circumstances apply. So the comparable and remote service and doable in a remote learning environment is the expectation. So Related service providers also have the obligation to develop what and how and when their plan will be deployed, to talk with parents and allow opportunities for feedback. And then for the portions that are doable, they will continue to develop those learning activities around the particular area of related service and to provide those.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that question. All right, Mr. Coe.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and board members. Before I get into my presentation, I wanted to echo Dr. McFarland's sentiments that we know in this changed context of remote learning, we have teachers and schools along with our students and families who are doing the very best that we can under the circumstances that we know are not easy. From our Student Support Services Department, I wanted to provide reminders for families about resources that are available, what our team is working on with social emotional learning right now, and how we're going to develop that for the future, and also give some context about crisis within our district since school closure. So if I go to the very first point, so for families, currently for our families, we still have up our resources on our remote learning site under emotional supports for students, and it's connected. What's the resources there are about how we can speak to our students about COVID-19. And in addition, on this slide, I've linked resources from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL, with resources for educators, parents, and caregivers. And finally, while students and families are doing the best they can, if there are any mental health concerns for themselves or their children, our families can contact Alliance Health at the number that's there. That's 1-800-510-9132. That's 24 hours a day. We just wanted to remind families that those resources are available to them in this current context. And for our staff, we're providing a continued online learning for our staff around social emotional learning that they can find through our Office of Professional Learning Wake Connect site. And also for our staff, the Employee Assistance Program is available to them in case they have any needs. They could go to the website with the URL there that's under www.deeroaks.com, or they can call the number there that's 1-866-327-2400. That's also available to them 24 hours a day. And we just wanted to provide these reminders because we know that our folks are working so hard, both our students, families, and our staff, as a reminder of resources. The next slide I'll go over is just what our Counseling and Student Services team is working on. Also, our team is known as CAS. So our school counselors, school social workers, and school psychologists are all working within their scopes in this remote learning environment to support our students and families that are outlined in the table below. And I think something to note is that because of the virtual environment, we're making sure that we're being cautious as possible about not entering into confidential conversations with students in this virtual environment, and just making sure that any check-ins with our students are around non-confidential matters, or it's related to follow-up around either family needs or eligibility evaluations through our school psychologists. And in addition, what our team is also working on, there is an interdepartmental team within academic advancement meeting regularly to develop further the integration of social emotional learning into our remote learning environment. That's going to include SEL guidance documents for staff outlining the best practices for a virtual environment for students and adults. And also, as we are thinking about whenever our pivot from a remote learning environment to back into brick and mortar school will be, as a team, we're also thinking about how we'll build the ramp back up to being in brick and mortar. So we're thinking about what is a return to school plan to ensure that we have a ramp for when we're back to brick and mortar. We're thinking through the context our families, students, and staff will be returning from and into post-COVID-19. We want to create best practice resources to help schools transition from a remote learning context into brick and mortar context. We're also developing professional learning for our CAS staff to support schools in return to brick and mortar context. And there is ongoing professional learning available to all staff. And again, as with so many things that we're working on, this is all work that is in development. We'll provide updates as we develop our work. And finally, on this last slide, you'll see some of the crisis incidents we've experienced as a school system since we've closed schools. And though our staff and student deaths are not COVID-19 related, these highlight some of the incredible difficulties our students and families may be encountering while we are in this remote learning environment. In addition, you'll see we've had 127 referrals to Alliance Health between March 16th and April 21st for our students and families in need. And we hope that our families who've sought out help are getting the help that they need. And I want to again encourage families and students to reach out to that Alliance number should there be a need, again, which is 1-800-510-9132, and it's available 24 hours a day. And finally, all of our principals and CAS team members have been given additional crisis guidance for our remote learning environment to continue to support our students and families as needed. Now, I'll pause for questions before I pass it to Drew Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Coe. Ms. Cash, you have a question?
I just have a comment. Thank you, Paul, for all the work that you've done in this area. It's been real noticeable. And I just want to mention that since I've kind of been involved in some nonprofit feeding, I've been at the school some, but I think that's why I'm so keenly aware and a little passionate about the social workers and our school counselors. It's been so noted on the sites that they identify so many needs that maybe teachers might not see right away or the principal might not, and have been very vocal about getting help for individual students. So I want to give a shout out to our school counselors and social workers. They've been very upfront about helping.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. I think they'll appreciate that note.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. Ms. Mahaffey.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Coe, if a family has a concern or a question, what is the best way for them to get in touch with their school counselor, or making sure that families know that school counselors are still available for them during this time when we're staying at home?
Yeah, I think the best way to do it is, unless they already have the school counselor's contact, instead of reaching out to them directly, I would say reach out to the school principal, and they should be able to direct the need to the right person that's under our student services team.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Johnson Hospital.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Coe, and again, Mr. Luca, and everybody on both of your teams who've made this all possible. Two things very similar to Ms. Cash having been supportive of organizations who've been working on this. One of the sites that I went to actually had the school counselor there, and really actually talked about her own experience of what she's seeing now, which is exactly what Ms. Cash said. But also for personally having done some of the actual delivery, saw firsthand, and of course got to see lots of kiddos and really expressing their own emotional and mental health concerns about dealing with this and how hard it was, and very open. And I will say this is not really usual for teenagers, but very open for how hard this is for them. So I echo Ms. Cash's sentiments, but I also think it's important that we have a lot of volunteers out there who are probably also getting this information, which I had not really thought about it this way until I actually made a delivery and had kids talking while I was putting together their lunch packet. So just something for us to be thoughtful about is we also have volunteers that are developing relationships who are kind of our constant deliverers, and those who are working at our sites who are not our employees, who are hearing a lot of this. And when I got back to the site, I asked folks, and they all agreed and echoed that they have seen and heard both students and their parents really expressing their concerns around mental health and well-being right now of our young people. So I wanted to echo Ms. Cash, but then also highlight that for those counselors who are working at those sites, they are working. Not only are they putting together food, which is why they thought they were there, but they are also working, providing their actual services as counselors to some of our students and families who are showing up. So just also a huge shout out to those folks who are doing this daily, who also I think we have to acknowledge are going to need a lot of supports too, because this is what we call in my day job also secondary trauma. They're experiencing other folks' trauma daily doing this for us. So I think we also have to acknowledge that for those folks who are doing this daily as well, it is definitely a different experience for them, even if they're mental health care professionals. And again, thanks for the work that we're doing, and I will continue to reiterate that for all of our folks who are doing this, that we grant each other grace, because it's really tough and everybody has all their personal stuff that's happening while they're still trying to work through this. So if we'll continue to grant folks and each other grace during this time. And thank you again for all of your team's work.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. And one thing I wanted to add to circle back to Ms. Mahaffey's comment is that if families want to reach out to counselors, they're also listed on all of our school websites, so they could reach out to their counselors through there and be able to reach out to them that way.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, for those comments and that reminder. All right, seeing no further hands on this topic, we'll move to academics. Mr. Cook.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide an update on grading with you today. If you'll recall, back 2 weeks ago when we engaged in this discussion, it was mentioned that guidance at the time indicated that in the event that North Carolina public schools remain closed after May the 15th, additional statewide guidance for grading would be provided by the state board in order to ensure consistency and equity across the state for all students. So that, of course, has happened or did happen late last week. So the intent of this segment of the agenda is to provide a brief overview of the updated grading policy parameters approved by the State Board of Education last Thursday, and also, of course, the implications for the Wake County Public School System and our students. In doing so, we will cover some of the key issues and considerations involved, including implications for grades K through 11, with a particular focus on the options being provided to high school students in grades 9 through 11, as well as promotion and retention decisions and next steps to be taken by the district moving forward. So while the updated state guidance certainly makes more clear some of the key grading and feedback parameters for schools and districts to follow, there are still a few details that need to be worked out to ensure that we're providing our teachers, our students, and our families with consistent direction and support across schools and grade levels for the remainder of the school year, which at this point we now know will be completed exclusively in a remote learning environment. So first, just a couple of notes about the guiding principles that were outlined in the State Board Policy Memo that were used by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction Grading Work Group that was tasked with drafting the new policy. As the policy memo indicates, input was solicited from multiple stakeholder groups across the state, including state board, student and superintendent advisors, district superintendents, UNC system, admissions directors and enrollment managers, North Carolina independent colleges and universities admissions directors, teacher and principal advisors, and also students and families through various contacts initiated by members of the public. And based on feedback from those groups, the desire for consistency in grading practices across the state, I think, was very clear, and certainly something that as a district we were and are in support of, at least in regards to consistency and equity for all students. The guiding principles that you see here were developed by the DPI work group to inform decision-making in determining the new grading parameters for grades K through 11. As you can see, those guiding principles include a statewide grading policy that positively impacts as many students as possible. And we've heard the term, and I think Ms. Johnson-Hostler just mentioned the term grace several times, and generosity. And understanding that no grading policy will solve all issues of inequities. Validating the efforts of students, families, teachers, and support staff during what are unprecedented remote learning circumstances. mitigating potential negative impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic as much as possible, addressing stakeholder concerns, including those from students and parents, and also to remember that all voices may not be at the table. So with that, we'll take a quick look at some of the key policy recommendations that were approved across grade levels. First, here with elementary, students will receive no final grade in grades K through 5. Instead of a final grade, teachers will provide year-end feedback for the full academic school year using a format that will be determined locally. So again, the focus will be not on the indication of whether or not the standards were mastered in the 1, 2, 3, and 4 scale that is typical for elementary schools, at least in regards to performance. And instead, the feedback will be provided by teachers for the entire school year. Teachers will also document individual student strengths and needs, both from an academic standpoint, but also, as pointed out by the policy guidance, from a social emotional perspective as well. And that information will be used in assisting with transition and preparation for the next academic calendar year. Now for middle schools in grades 6 through 8, students will receive a PC-19 pass or withdrawal indicated by WC-19 for the final course grades. Teachers will document individual student strengths and needs, again, both from an academic and social emotional perspective. One important distinction of note is that high school courses taken in middle school will follow the outlined high school grading options that we'll go over in just a moment. In addition, both the PC-19 and WC-19 options have now been added in PowerSchool, just from a technical capability standpoint. So now moving into high school grades 9 through 11, which I think, as you all well know, is the area of the policy that has generated the most discussion and attention over the past few weeks. Students in grades 9 through 11 will be given a choice for how each course grade will appear on their transcript for both year-long and semester courses that are currently in progress. Essentially, students have 2 options based on the state board guidance for each of their final course grades. Those options are either a numeric grade, which will be the highest grade representing learning as of March the 13th, or as improved through the semester as remote learning continued. Or students can choose the PC-19 or WC-19 option. Students will not receive a failing grade as per the state board guidance. Just a few additional notes about the choices that are involved here, which in many circumstances may be very clear as to what is the best option for the student. But I think it's also important to point out in other cases, that decision may be much more complex and require some significant support and guidance from teachers and counselors and other support staff. Students will determine how each final course grade will appear on the transcript at the end of the semester after advising from the teacher and the school and in consultation with their parents and or guardians. So just to be clear, it will not be an all or nothing decision, such that a student, for example, could elect to post 2 numerical grades while also deciding to post 2 PC-19 pass grades on their transcript. Also, when students choose to report a numeric grade as the final grade on the transcript, the numeric grade will be calculated into the cumulative GPA. When students choose to report a PC-19 or a WC-19 as the final grade on the transcript, there is no GPA impact when using those grades. When students in a year-long course choose a PC-19 or a WC-19 for the spring portion of the course, the fall term grade will be counted into the GPA. And with all of this, clear directions for PowerSchool, we understand will be coming at a later date. So, in addition to these issues, there are other factors and important considerations that the updated policy obviously covers, specifically in regards to high school grades 9 through 11. And just a few of those examples and additional considerations we'll touch on. Districts are being encouraged to use all means possible to support student learning, such as credit recovery or repeating a course for credit. We'll also be looking at issuing temporary grades of incomplete that can be used locally in instances where we determine it to be appropriate. Students will maintain the grades for fall courses as already stored, both year-long and semester. Fall 2019 final grades will be calculated into a student's GPA. So there's a lot of information there for our 9th through 11th graders. Again, partially because of the attention and the questions and the complexity that are involved at the high school level for those students. So for high school seniors, just to be clear, while there was some brief discussion by the state board last Thursday, ultimately nothing has changed for those students at this time, and the previous state board guidance that was issued on March the 27th and updated on April the 2nd still stands as is. So no changes at this time for our high school seniors based on what was previously communicated. And then one last area that the updated policy references is in regards to promotion and retention decisions. Just a couple of notes. The approved policy does stipulate that student promotion and retention will remain the decision of the school principal and staff. Also, districts and schools should only consider retention of students if the retention consideration process was already well underway for a student prior to March 13th, 2020. And finally, if a student was being considered for retention prior to the 13th of March and is still being considered for retention, districts are strongly encouraged to develop and implement a local plan to ensure effective communication and collaboration between the school and the family to determine the most effective path forward for the student. Recognizing, again, the extraordinary circumstances that students and families find themselves in as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting extended school closure. So finally, speaking of a local plan, obviously our task since last Thursday afternoon and in the days ahead, like all the other 114 LEAs across the state, is to take the updated policy guidance that we've received and develop more specific details and guidelines to ensure that as much as possible, consistent and effective implementation occurs across the district. So in short, that will mean we'll be reviewing any additional state DPI resources and information that will be shared in the coming days. We just received a heads up, I believe, this afternoon about some of what we can expect to receive, including a webinar, I believe, that the state will be conducting tomorrow, Wednesday, April the 30th. There'll also be, we understand, an implementation toolkit that will be provided next week, we believe by May the 5th, that will include updated academic guidance, guidance and recorded directions from a technical standpoint for Power School, and we also expect to get other relevant information that will inform our district level implementation. So again, based on the additional guidance from the state that's forthcoming, we will be determining local structures and processes to support implementation that is, of course, aligned with the state board policy. And then subsequently, of course, we will be communicating with students, teachers, parents, and the community accordingly. We know there's time sensitivity, and students like my 16-year-old want to know exactly right now what to expect, and we respect and understand that. We want to use all available means to ensure there is a collective understanding of what this policy means for students. So ultimately, our direction on grading is certainly more clear than it was just a few days ago, but we've still got a few details to work out. And as always, we are committed to finding the absolute best solutions that we can to meet the needs of all of our students, which of course is no small task given the circumstances that we are currently experiencing. So at this time, like others, happy to answer any questions about grading or associated practices.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Haggerty.
Yes. Again, thank you, Mr. Cook. I really appreciate all the details you've been able to provide. I know this information is coming down from the state, and you and everyone on your staff is working really hard to get updated information out. I want to make sure that I understand something that you said earlier in your presentation. Did I hear you that middle schoolers taking high school classes that could transfer to high school will have the option of being graded?
Yes, sir. If we're interpreting the language in the current state board policy, there is specific guidance that if a middle school student is enrolled in a high school course for credit, then they would, in fact, like a high school student, have the same option that our 9th through 11th graders do for that course.
Okay, thank you. So I guess what I would like to ask as a follow-up to that is, are there steps that we can take to alert parents, middle school parents, taking a high school level course in middle school, but who may not understand it? For example, if a middle schooler is taking Math 1 or Math 2, are they considered high school level course? Or in some cases, if they have a language course that can satisfy high school credit with that.
Drew, if I could step in for just a second before you complete that.
Sure.
And I'd ask folks to check their mics if they're not speaking. Just to clarify, Mr. Haggerty, the student in middle school who is taking a high school course for credit can request to have the grade reflected on their report card, but on the high school transcript, those grades only give you credit. They do not give you anything towards the GPA calculation. So those middle school courses do show on the high school transcript as credit-bearing courses, but no GPA impact. But nonetheless, those students may want the grade to show versus just the pass.
Thank you, Superintendent Moore. If I can get one more bit of clarification, then, even though it would only show up as a credit on the high school transcript, the impact placement. Or to clarify, would a grade that a middle schooler earns in a high school level course potentially affect their placement in a section of the course in high school?
Drew, I'm going to let you take that one.
Yes, sir, Mr. Haggerty. I'm sorry, it may just be on my end, but you were breaking up a little bit there. But I think, as Ms. Moore did state, that the course credit that's earned, regardless of a middle school student's decision to accept the pass or the numeric grade, will not be credit bearing in terms of quality point calculation. And I think to your question, Mr. Haggard, if I heard it correctly, I think as would be the case in more normal circumstances, any decisions that are made about next course placements would of course involve, middle school performance and those kinds of things. I think obviously in these circumstances, when we're talking about grace and generosity, and I think your point is well taken, another consideration that we're going to have to be making systematically across our district when it comes to next course recommendations and access to next courses is the fact that some of the perhaps more traditional thresholds that might be utilized in making those recommendations, the data is not going to be as reliable as it ordinarily would be. So, for example, if a student had an A or a B, or we were still taking an EOG or an EOC and made a 4 or a 5 on the state assessment, those things might be factored into whether or not they get recommended for the next level course, understanding that ultimately students and parents can waive out and take essentially any course they choose to. But I think in the end, it'll be really important, as you pointed out, for us to, number one, make sure all of our parents and students in middle school are aware of the specific high school courses that their students are taking and which courses they will have this option with. And I think secondary to that is that our teachers and our schools and our district will have to work really hard to make sure that we are truly holding students harmless when it comes to next course recommendation and access, given the circumstances that we're in this spring. And I think that's just another example of how this is not just a spring 2020 impact. This is an impact that will have more far-reaching consequences even into the next school year. And I hope that answered your question, sir.
It did. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hegarty. Ms. Johnson Hosler.
Thank you. So Drew, I tried to listen carefully. I still think you might have to explain to me, because like you, I also have a child who needs to know right now. So it may be what you were referring to that will be in the later guidance. And this is back to the grading, or how they're going to make choices around grading. So if a child has, I don't know, a C at March 13th, when we say that they have the ability to change, that the grade can move higher, is that based on new learning, new assignments, or do those grades change because they're doing remediation?
That is a great question, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, and I think you referenced it, and it's accurate. This is perhaps one of the biggest gray areas that the state board policy is not explicit on, that I believe districts will need to determine. And so I think the specific language, if I'm reading it accurately, under the numeric grade choice, says the highest grade representing learning as of March 13th, or, quote, as improved through the semester as remote learning continued. And so to your question, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, that is where I think as a district we will need to define the parameters of what that looks like. Is that going to involve new learning that occurs solely in the remote learning environment, which we now know will continue until the end of the year, recognizing that there are still significant variations in student ability to access the learning and focus at the level that we would typically expect them to be able to? Or is that going to involve, additional work that could be completed for third quarter, or a combination of the two? So I think to answer your question more succinctly, that is something that is yet to be determined, but it is a critical component of what we'll need to decide as a district.
Thank you, Drew. And unfortunately, we all know, excuse me, Mr. Ford talked about this, who sits on the state board, but we also know that this, and the reason why I think I was trying to figure out if the state board is going to give guidance, because some districts have completely been giving grades for new fourth quarter assignments, and some haven't. So I'm curious if you all had guidance yet, but you answered my question. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. And I would just add, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, that I know, and we all recognize and understand there's urgency and there's angst and there's stress about what exactly, where do I stand as a student? What can I expect? I want to know the rules of the game, quote unquote, so that I'm not harmed and I can maximize the opportunities for success that I have. We're also, I think, obviously reluctant, knowing that even within the next week or so, additional information is forthcoming. We would rather get the answer right than get the answer quickly.
So you can tell me offline how you're explaining that to your 16-year-old, and I'll just relay that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Ms. Mahaffey.
Yes, thank you. So, Mr. Cook, with what I heard from you is that if I am a high school student, I don't have an all or nothing. So my 4 classes, if I'm on the semester, I can decide that I'm going to do my academic classes pass fail, and then my higher weighted classes focus on those for grades. Is that correct?
Well, and so, yes, ma'am, there is not an all or nothing approach. And so it literally could be, and this is where I think it's important to understand that the choice is not as simple as it may seem on the surface. And I think Mr. Cohen and I have already been having conversations, and Brian Pittman at the high school level has been having conversations with Crystal Reardon in counseling. The reality is that this is really potentially complex. And depending on what a student's GPA is, and depending on, as you referenced, whether or not the course is bearing an extra half quality point as an honors course or an extra full quality point as an AP course, it may not be as simple as taking the P versus the B. It may come down to factoring in the multiple variables for how that quantifies into a GPA. And even then, and I think this is important to point out as well, The fact that students now have a choice, we have to be, and our counselors will have to be very cognizant and conscientious of wondering how that choice will be viewed by college admissions boards. And, I think our state universities have gone out of their way to say that they're going to extend abundant grace and flexibility when it comes to grades for this semester, and we believe that to be the case. But all of those factors have to be weighed in, even whether or not a student is better off taking a slightly lower GPA to have a numeric grade on a transcript when they were provided that option by the state. And so those are some examples of how complex some of these choices may be for students and the level of guidance and support they're going to require from staff.
Well, and I imagine, in addition to looking at, GPAs in a different light, given these options, the guidance for teachers when you're managing a class in these new circumstances, how many kids are going, on a pass, how many are going with a grade, how do you, continue to give grades, or what does that management look like for teachers? Because this seems like another level on top of all these new circumstances that they're already dealing with.
Yes, ma'am, and I think that is, and we've been talking to teachers in the last few days, and I heard from a couple directly today, and I mean there are some as we say, devil is in the details, and there are some details here that need to be worked out, and I think we will be waiting to see what additional direction and support the state provides, and the reality is ultimately we're going to have to make some decisions and provide some guidance to our teachers to ensure there is some level of consistency and thus equity when it comes to how students are treated from a grading standpoint and the opportunities that they're being provided. And obviously, as we all well know, and we've talked about before, there will always be some degree of variation within schools, much less across schools when it comes to grading practices. I think we would, again, in this instance, as is always, work to find the balance between that flexibility and variability and a level of consistency for our teachers and our students to make sure we don't have kids within the same district or even within the same school that could potentially be disadvantaged by decisions that are made at the classroom or at the school level.
And that decision by students is made once. It's not, a couple weeks from now, I can decide, I don't really want to work for this grade. I'm going to go pass. Correct?
I believe so. And I think the language in the state guidance is at the end of a semester. But I think even that, Ms. Mahaffey, elicits some questions. If I'm a student right now who does not have access and I'm working 2 jobs to support my family, and I would love the opportunity to have a chance to earn a letter in any course, whether it's academic, honors, or advanced placement, I think a question that will be asked is, should that student be provided an extended opportunity to engage in a deeper level of instruction to have a chance to earn the same numeric grade that perhaps their classmates had access to that they did not? Just as students will have opportunities in an extended manner to bring their grade up to passing, those that might get a withdrawal grade or incomplete. I think, I don't know that has been fully determined yet as to whether or not whatever decision a student makes at the end of the semester will stand. Obviously, there'll have to be some decisions made that make that very clear on when those deadlines are going to be.
And then my final question, it's most likely to be discussed at a further date, but I'm sure you're hearing and your team is hearing a lot of questions from our senior class and their families and teachers about graduation and commencement, with school being done, in the building and being done remotely until the end of this school year. What is graduation going to look like? Are we finding ways to bring student voice into that? And is there a team coming together to talk about it? And if so, who's that comprised of?
Yes, ma'am, and pertinent question. And obviously, I think as much as any group of students right now, we all feel and are sensitive to our class of 2020 members and their families. Having had a daughter that just a year ago this time was experiencing her senior year and all the excitement that comes along with that, I think all of us, I think while we haven't worked out details and there is a lot to be determined and there are still many unknowns, I think we're committed to finding some potential solutions to provide that opportunity to students that are in the graduating class of 2020, even if it's very different and non-traditional in the way that it's set up. So I don't know that I've got any more details to share beyond that right now, but I can tell you there is a group of folks that are working behind the scenes. I know our chief officers and our superintendent spent a lot of time, even yesterday, talking about potential contingencies. So we don't have details yet, but I do believe that in the near future, we'll be able to provide some of the options that we're considering and where we may land to try to make the most of a very difficult situation for our high school seniors.
Right. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Mr. Cook, thank you for that response. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mrs. Moore, I turn it back over to you for any closing thoughts.
I think I would just reiterate through all of the presentations that, it's interesting the amount of work that's actually having to take place in order to support these transitions and remote learning for teachers and families. I hope that you can see that we remain committed to looking at all aspects of that, whether it is technical work identified with serving the needs of our special ed identified students, looking at the whole child from the point of view of their social emotional learning needs and the transitions that are occurring and the environment that they're learning in and how we support teaching and learning through also paying attention to those student needs, and even down to the nitty-gritty of grading and the advice that's coming down, the commentary we get from parents, the structures and policy changes coming from DPI. There's a lot of work before us, and yet we are prepared to continue to work on behalf of students and families to make sure that we close this school year with real, true learning happening for our students, and in ways that allow them to be as prepared as we can possibly be for next year, knowing that remote learning and really in no way replaces the classroom, but we must respond to the circumstances that we have before us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that. This brings our work session to a close. It's just shortly after 5. If there are not any other questions or closing thoughts, we will adjourn this meeting and disconnect and then move toward our public meeting at 5:30. At this point, I will declare our work session today adjourned. Thank you for all that participated, and we'll see you shortly.